So, how to feed a hungry world? This is a subject that demographers, and I'm a demographer, should come to with a degree of humility. After all, we're not experts on food. We have no particular insight into agriculture, the biology of plants or animals. We have no particular knowledge on the production of food. But we do know a thing or two about mouths. And feeding a hungry world is not just about food, it's about the ratio of food to mouths. So we know a thing or two about mouths, not their anatomy, not their function, that we will leave to our friends the dentists, but rather to their distribution over space and to their number, rising and falling over time. Indeed, you could say that demography as a discipline was born out of a dispute on the question of the relationship of food and mouths. And it all started back in the late 18th century, or at least so we Anglophobes think, with a youngish English clergyman called Thomas Malthus. Now, Malthus had a father and a mother. You see the father, Daniel, on the right. The mother, as it happens for gender equality, happens to have been painted by the famous English artist Hogarth as a baby. She's on the extreme left. But anyway, Daniel Malthus, the father, Malthus père, was a great friend of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a friend of William Godwin, the English anarchist, husband of the better known Mary Wollstonecraft of the Vindication of the Rights of Women. And Daniel and his generation thought that the great future of humanity lay in the French Enlightenment and ultimately in the French Revolution. Get rid of the fusty old institutions, clear away tired old custom, let the light of reason into the organization of human society and economy, and you would end vice and want, wickedness and hunger. Not so fast, said the son, Thomas Malthus. Because he said you're missing a critical point. However reasonable and rational and clever your social organization is, you will have the unstoppable force of human population, double, and doubling again, meeting the unmovable object, or only slowly moving object, of the ability of people to feed themselves. A generation would double and double again, but so far as food production was concerned, you'd only manage very slow growth. And so if war didn't get you, and pandemic and disease didn't get you, ultimately a sheer lack of food would ensure that you didn't survive or thrive in the kind of numbers you would have done. Now, Malthus wrote his ideas down in his famous population essay of 1789. He developed them, and he came to the view that ultimately we had a choice as humans. Three choices. We could have want, hunger, by breeding and breeding to the limits of what we could produce. We could have vice, what he called vice, abortion, infanticide, and the fundamental basic contraception available in his day. He disapproved of all of those, being an orthodox Anglican clergyman. Or we could have restraint. Don't marry until you can afford a family. Control your sexuality. That is the only solution to humans not to be either wicked or hungry. And so Malthus thought this through, and it seems, of course, that Malthus must have been right. In the year 1, that's 2022 years ago, there were 250 million people in the world. Imagine each woman then had just 4 children, and all those 4 children had survived, and then they'd gone on to have 4 children. By the year 50, you'd have had about 1 billion people in the world. Well, it took not until the year 50, but until the year 1800, from the reign of Julius Caesar to almost the reign of Queen Victoria, for the world's population to meet 1 billion. Precisely as Malthus had said, because if war didn't get you and disease didn't get you, hunger would ensure that the population simply could not expand greater than very, very slowly. But Malthus may have been right about the past, but he was fundamentally wrong about the future, standing in the year 1800, around when he was publishing. And he was wrong in 2 ways. He was wrong both about our ability to control our fertility, but he was also wrong about the only incremental gains that we could make in food production. And that's why this ratio of food to mouths has been revolutionized since Malthus's time. So I want, in the 12 minutes or so that remains, to look briefly at these two sides of the Malthusian equation. On the one hand, the reproduction of people, and on the other hand, the growth of food. So to start on the purely demographic side, in a state of nature, having normal sexual relations throughout her fertile years, a woman would have about 8 children. Now, some would have none, some would have more. I once had lunch in a family in London with no fewer than 15 kids. But overall, on average, they would have 8 children. And of course, as we've seen, even 4 would have led to a great population explosion. Indeed, one demographer said that ultimately, if you carried on like that, human population would be expanding into the universe at faster than the speed of light, which couldn't happen. So of course, it hasn't happened. By the time we got to the 1960s, with the rise of contraception, the fertility rate in the world, the average woman was having about 4 children. So about half of what she would have had naturally. And that had been achieved through the spread of contraception through much of the developed world. But that's continued ever since. Today, the fertility rate of the world is at about 2 children per woman. So it's halved since I was born, and I'm not that old. And it's continuing to come down. And in the time that it's halved globally, it's fallen much more quickly in certain countries. So for example, in China, since the 1960s and 70s, the fertility rate of the world of China has fallen by about 1/7 of what it was back in the year 1970. In Korea, it's fallen to about 1/6. So we've seen an absolute transformation in the fertility rate of women and families. And that's been achieved, as I said, through contraception. But contraception's just a technology. The point is that people have wanted to adopt it. And the reason they've wanted to adopt it is that they've got more educated, they've got more urban, and they've got wealthier. And as those things happen, people aspire to smaller families on the whole, notwithstanding my friends in London with their 15 kids. So why is that? Well, there are many theories, but ultimately you can give an economic theory. In the farm, another pair of hands is always useful. In the city, where you can invest in your children's education and get very real returns, it makes sense to have smaller families. And so there have been some awful exceptions. The enforced sterilization in India, relatively briefly in the 1970s, the long period of what I consider the wicked one-child policy in China from the early 80s until very recently. Wicked, unnecessary, and counterproductive. But left to their own devices, people in the modern world will choose to have smaller families as they get wealthier, as they get more urban, and as particularly women get more educated and have other things to do with their lives than just have very large families. There are exceptions. Africa is an exception, but with Africa, the picture is not uniform. North Africa, most of the countries in North Africa have got their fertility rates down to 3 or below. South Africa and its neighbors, it's come down a long way. There are some big countries in East Africa, like Kenya and Ethiopia, that are succeeding in reducing their fertility rates. And there are a few countries in West Africa where it's still very, very high, and they've got a long way to go. But on the whole, we've got fertility rates down. What that means, of course, is that the population growth falls. On the other hand, mortality is falling as well. Fewer people are dying because they're living longer. The thing is, though, you can only live so long. Even the Japanese, the longest living people in the earth, lived to about 85. You can delay death, but you cannot delay it forever. But fertility can fall and fall and fall again. It can plummet. And that's the main reason why, if you look at this chart, the population of the world was growing at about 2% a year back in the early 1970s, and today it's growing at about 1% a year. And every year, the population growth of the world slows down. It'll probably go to about 0.5% a year in the next 20 years, and by the end of this century, at the very latest, global population will have stabilized. So we'll have a stabilizing number of mouths to feed. And that's the first part of Thomas Malthus's equation, which has been turned on its head. We don't forever expand and expand and expand our populations. What he would have thought of modern contraception, I don't know, but very few people today would think of it as vice, as perhaps Malthus would. And so we have successfully managed through technology and through social change to slow down the growth in the number of mouths, the population growth. So let's move to the question of food. Now, in Malthus's day, and for whole of history back to the year dot, you basically ate from what was produced locally. Transport was primitive. It was very expensive to bring food long distances. For a tiny number of wealthy people, it was possible to bring spices from the east to Europe, say. Some communities living by the coast could be fed off fish from distant seas, but on the whole, you ate where you lived where you ate, and if you ran out of food, if you had a famine, you had to move. We know from the Bible that people were moving due to famines and droughts thousands of years ago. And as late as the 1840s, in the United Kingdom, which was then the most advanced part of the world, millions of people had to leave Ireland, which was then in the United Kingdom, and move to America because of the potato blight. So in Malthus's era, the constraints on food were very severe. But then it changed, and in a number of ways. Transport developed, particularly the railway and the steamship, and whole continents could be brought into modern agricultural techniques. Areas in Australia and the Americas that had once fed tens of thousands were able to feed tens of millions. Tough for the people who were living there, but transformative in terms of the demography first of Europe and the rest of the world. And the population of Europe grew. But then again, by the end of the 19th century, we'd reached another limit. There was a lack of artificial fertilizer. And then along came the Haber-Bosch process. It's said that half the people in the world today are only alive thanks to the Haber-Bosch process. The fixation of nitrogen in the soil, which meant crop yields could grow enormously. And so once again, population took off, despite world wars and all the disasters of the early 20th century. By the 1960s, population, as you may have seen, was growing very, very rapidly, and people again became worried about our ability to feed the world. The famous biologist Paul Ehrlich said that civilization was going to collapse, that billions were going to die. Civilization did not collapse, billions didn't die. Where people died of famine, it was more to do with incompetent governments like the Marxist regime in Ethiopia than anything to do with the lack of food. And so we've managed to increase our agricultural output, particularly in that period back in the 60s and 70s due to the Green Revolution. And we've only started. Today, using current technology in transport and more investment in storage of food, we could grow much further using current technologies, the output of the world agricultural sector. There's no reason why yields in Cuba should be half the yields in Brazil. So there's huge amount we could produce more just using what we know today. And those of you who've been paying attention in this conference in the last few days will know of all the amazing technologies coming down the road, the hydroponics, the artificial meat, which are going to transform the way we produce food. And so it is that whilst population has grown steadily, it looks like it's steady. On a logarithmic scale, you'd see it was slowing from 1% a year to 2% a year to 1% a year, and so on. And on the other hand, the yields per acre have been rising. Corn, maize, rice, and wheat far faster than population. And when that happens, we have a better fed world. Back in the 1970s, the average consumption was about 2,000 calories a day per head. Today, it's about 3,000 calories a head. Just since the year 2000, the percentage of people in East Asia, one of the world's most successful regions, that are underfed has fallen from 15% to 5% just in the last 20 years. And if you look at some of the more successful countries in the Middle East, like the one we're in, the numbers are probably even more extraordinary. So that doesn't mean we should put away the agricultural file. We've solved all the problems. Hunger's over. We can focus on other things. Dear ministers, dear civil servants, there are still challenges ahead. And I want to focus on three things that we should think about before we say our work is done in terms of feeding a hungry world. First of all, there will be short-term and temporary and local crises. It's hard to think of a crisis like anything worse than Ukraine and Russia going to war. These are two big agricultural producers. But when it happens, the global community is challenged to do something about it, whether that's about freeing the ports on the Black Sea or it's about finding other ways of feeding those who are most hungry in the world. We need to overcome those kinds of, hopefully, temporary and local disturbances. The second thing is we need to continue reducing the ratio of inputs to outputs. The chart I showed of the production of corn and maize and wheat was per acre. It wasn't the global production. So we're already getting much, much smarter in using a given amount of land to produce additional crops. We need to continue doing that, and with things, as I said, like hydroponics and artificial meat, that's quite feasible. And that will allow us less space, fewer chemicals, to thrive as a human species, to eat well, and to leave plenty of space for other species and for the environment to thrive and to prosper as well. And then finally, ironically, many more governments today are challenged by the problem of obesity and overweight than they are by underweight. And indeed, there's a gender issue here. Wherever there's a shortage of food, it's the boys that get best fed. Wherever there is too much food or more food than people need, in many societies, particularly those that have recently come to food adequacy, it's still the boys that get best fed, and the boys often have a particular obesity problem. So we could be moving into a world where the biggest challenge is not too little food, but too much. And we need to think about distribution, and we need to think about healthy food. So I am not saying put away the file. I'm not saying forget the problem. The challenges are still there, they're slightly different. And specifically now, because we are so capable as a human race of producing enough food for every mouth, we shouldn't rest until no child is going to bed hungry. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.